Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Ballou, and this is Sophia Pinzi. We are both researchers at the Center for Integrated Pest Management at North Carolina State University. And today we're speaking with Dr. Daniel Anco, who's an extension peanut specialist at Clemson University, South Carolina. Dr. Anco works closely with growers on disease management, and he will be sharing his expertise on IPM strategies for late leaf spot. Dr. Anco, thank you for being with us today, and we're excited to learn from your experience.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, Dr. Anko. So just some questions. For start, could you give us a brief overview of leaf spot disease and its impact?
Okay, sure. So there are two main types of leaf spots that share that name. There's late leaf spot, which I'll primarily be talking about today, and early leaf spot. They are caused by different fungi, but they do share many similarities. Late leaf spot gets its name by typically developing symptoms a little bit later in the growing season compared to early leaf spot, but they both cause leaf spots on the leaves. And they're not necessarily limited only to causing lesions on the leaves. They can also cause lesions on the stems as well. The fungus survives typically on plant debris in the soil, and so at the beginning of the growing season, the first lesions are typically found in that lower part of the canopy because the spores are coming up from where the fungus is there in the soil when it is not coming in from a neighboring field, being blown that way. And so it'll typically start as a small lesion that can either be um, black or maybe dark brown with a hint of purpley color to it. Sometimes there are yellow chlorotic halos surrounding the lesions, but not always. And as the disease epidemic progresses, then those lesions can spread to other leaves, which are either in the middle section of the canopy or higher up. And as the epidemic further progresses, the leaves and the leaflets can become weakened. And then typically when they have about 50% or more of a leaflet being covered or affected by a lesion, then it can defoliate and fall off. And then that causes the peanut plant to become weakened, and then that in turn weakens the peg strength that holds on to those pods that are underneath the ground. And so when the peanut plant is excessively defoliated, particularly 50% or more, then we really start to see increases in the loss that we have from those pods that are going to be left in the ground when it comes time to dig those peanut plants. Um, Late leaf spot is host specific. It is not known that the fungus affects other plants. And so that's one of the things that is important for this disease. Um, Other items in related to its disease biology, it's considered a polycyclic disease. And so when you have those lesions that are produced, then those in turn can produce spores that can then spread to other host tissues.
Okay. What climate and environmental conditions influence leaf spot development?
Yeah, good question. This is primarily a moderate temperature disease in and around 20 to 24 degrees Celsius, but it is more so driven by the availability of moisture, whether that comes through rainfall or irrigation and or the availability of high levels of relative humidity in and around 95% or more for extended periods of time.
Mm.
And while the spores are produced on those lesions, typically that underside of the lesion, then they can be spread by wind itself, but greater numbers of spores are typically spread through windblown rain.
Okay. What IPM techniques are commonly used to manage leaf spot?
Okay, yeah, good question. And similar to many other diseases or pest problems, the most effective management comes about through an integrated, combination of several different techniques. Some of the cultural practices that we'll utilize include rotating away from peanut for at least 3 years. Longer periods of rotation have an improved effect in reducing those surviving levels of inoculant. that are in the field. And the other thing that goes along with that, because this fungus is host specific to peanut or groundnut, then in those years where a different crop is planted in the field, then as much as possible, if we're able to reduce the survival of volunteer peanut plants that come up, then that's going to increase the efficacy of that year as being a functional rotation year. Otherwise, the availability of those volunteer peanuts can serve as a green bridge that allows the fungus to survive from one year to another. That's one option. Another item that is commonly employed is where conditions are favorable to planting, being able to plant slightly earlier in the growing season compared to slightly later. And that helps to get the crop developing ahead of when the fungus typically would be more available later on in the growing season. That is helpful as well, particularly for those varieties that are more susceptible. Those tend to get better results when they're planted a little bit earlier in the planting window. But of course, we still need to have conducive temperature and soil moisture conditions. It still needs to be a good time to plant the peanut during that time.
Mhm.
If there is the availability of cultivars that have higher levels of resistance, of course, that's a great option that's able to be used, but there are different limitations as far as which varieties themselves would be available. Compared to planting under a conventional tillage situation or a strip tillage into like a reduced tillage situation, sometimes we see a benefit planting into that reduced tillage situation. And the idea there being that there being the presence of a cover that helps to interfere with the dissemination of those spores coming from the ground and going into affecting the available plant tissues there. And then I guess going away from the cultural aspect, the targeted use of preventative fungicides is a very important tool for our commercial producers in the South Carolina area as well. And then, of course, availability of water. It's a double-edged sword right there. The crop needs water in order to grow, and the fungus also benefits from the availability of water. So overhead irrigation affects both of those components that way. And then the other thing that we can do too, a lot of our management is geared towards prevention and limiting the development of leaf spot infections. The other thing that we take into account is when the fungus is already established and infections are already proceeding at the end of the growing season, if we are starting to get defoliation in non-negligible amounts, once it's ideally we want to dig the peanuts before it ends up getting about 50% defoliated. That way we can cut the losses because at that point, more or less that's a kind of a big picture view of it. Uh, Once it starts to reach and then exceed 50% defoliation, then the rate at which the loss of pods increases, that exceeds the rate that we would typically potentially gain from the additional development of maturity.
Oh, I see. Um, so in your experience, which practices are the most effective, and which one are the most widely adopted in South Carolina?
Yeah. Another a good question. And so we often have an intentional integration of many of these different practices. Now, if we only needed to pick a couple of them, rotating out of peanut, having an effective, clear rotation with volunteer control out of peanut for several years, three or more, that's very effective. The use of resistant varieties makes a big difference in both how much disease may develop, how much defoliation we might get, and then how much loss we might get as a result of potential defoliation on those varieties. Moving up our planting date, that's also very commonly implemented, particularly for areas that have a known history of leaf spot infection, and then of course the fungicide use in commercial situations.
Okay. Dr. Anco, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us today. Your insight on late leaf spot management have been very helpful, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.